I felt the heavy weight of judgment the moment I walked through the staff room door. Conversations hushed to whispers. Eyes darted away from mine, then back again when they thought I wasn't looking. I straightened my back, clutched my leather satchel tighter, and moved toward the coffee maker with deliberate steps. The new history teacher. The one with the PhD. The one married to Vince Kingsley, the school's head of security. My husband didn't know I was here yet. That revelation would come in approximately 30 minutes, when he arrived for his morning briefing. By then, I'd be safely ensconced in my classroom, preparing for my first day teaching modern American history to disinterested teenagers. Abigail Hayes? I turned at the sound of my name, my professional name, not the one that appeared on my marriage certificate. I'd insisted on keeping my maiden name when I'd published my dissertation, much to Vince's displeasure. "That's me," I replied, extending my hand to the petite woman with short silver hair and piercing blue eyes. Diane Blackwell. Department head. Her handshake was firm, authoritative. "Principal Rothman mentioned you just moved back to Oak Ridge. Welcome home." I forced a smile. "Thank you. It's good to be back." It wasn't. Nothing about returning to my hometown felt good. Especially not the part where I was keeping secrets from the man who'd spent 14 years systematically dismantling my ambitions. "Your credentials are quite impressive," Diane continued, eyeing me with curious respect. "Princeton. Summa cum laude. Doctorate in American History with a focus on civil rights movements. Published author. We're lucky to have you." I felt my cheeks warm under her praise. Even after all these years, I still wasn't accustomed to having my accomplishments acknowledged. "Thank you," I said again, pouring coffee into a mug that proclaimed teachers change the world one student at a time. "I'm excited to start." "Well, I should warn you." Whatever warning Diane was about to deliver was cut short by the staff room door swinging open. A tall, broad-shouldered man with salt and pepper hair and a scowl that could curdle milk strode in, his security uniform pressed to military precision. My stomach dropped. Vince. His eyes swept the room in the automatic assessment of threats that had become second nature during his 20 years as a police officer. When his gaze landed on me, time seemed to compress. I watched emotion after emotion flicker across his face, confusion, disbelief, betrayal, anger, all in the span of seconds. "Abby?" His voice was dangerously quiet. "What are you doing here?" Diane looked between us, her brow furrowed. "You two know each other?" Before I could answer, Vince's expression hardened into the mask I knew too well. The one that meant trouble was brewing. "She's my wife," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. The staff room fell silent. I could feel every teacher, administrator, and staff member watching the drama unfold, already mentally composing the gossip they'd share later. "Your wife?" Diane echoed, clearly blindsided. "But your paperwork said." "I use my maiden name professionally," I interjected, desperate to wrest back some control of the situation. "Hayes was my name when I earned my degrees." Vince's jaw tightened. Degrees I knew nothing about. The air in the room seemed to thin. I clutched my coffee mug tighter, grateful for the scalding heat against my palms. It anchored me to the present, reminded me that I wasn't the same cowed woman who'd left Oak Ridge 14 years ago. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately," I suggested, my voice steadier than I felt. "Principal Rothman's office. Now." Vince's tone left no room for argument. As we walked through the hallway's intense silence, I mentally rehearsed the speech I'd prepared for this exact scenario. The careful explanation I'd crafted to help him understand why I'd hidden my education, my career, my entire intellectual life from him. But when Principal Rothman closed his office door behind us, leaving the three of us alone in his sparsely decorated office, all my carefully chosen words abandoned me. "Would someone like to explain what's happening?" Principal Rothman asked, his bushy eyebrows raised almost to his receding hairline. Vince crossed his arms. "My wife has apparently been leading a double life." "That's not fair," I protested, the familiar defensive posture slipping into place as easily as breathing. "I never lied to you." "Lying by omission is still lying, Abby." Vince's voice was tightly controlled, but I could hear the hurt beneath the anger. 14 years of marriage, and I'm just now finding out my wife has a doctorate? That she's published books? That she's been teaching college classes? Principal Rothman's eyebrows climbed even higher. "I take it there's been some miscommunication between you two?" I laughed, the sound hollow even to my own ears. "You could say that. When you said you were visiting your sister in Philadelphia all those weekends, you were actually attending classes?" Vince demanded. "When you told me you were doing research for your novel, you were actually writing academic papers?" I met his gaze. "Yes." "Why?" The single word contained multitudes: betrayal, confusion, and beneath it all, a flicker of something that looked like fear. I took a deep breath. "Because 14 years ago, you made it very clear that you didn't want a wife with academic ambitions. You wanted someone who would support your career, keep your house, raise your children." Vince flinched. "That's not." "It is," I insisted, years of pent-up frustration finally finding release. "You said, and I quote, 'No wife of mine is going to waste time and money on degrees she'll never use.' You said education was a luxury we couldn't afford while you were building your career in law enforcement." Principal Rothman cleared his throat awkwardly. "Perhaps I should give you two some privacy." "No," Vince and I said simultaneously. I continued. "I'm starting work today, as scheduled. Whatever issues my husband and I need to resolve can wait until we're home." Vince's expression darkened. "You expect me to just pretend everything's normal? To watch you walk around these halls knowing that our entire marriage has been built on lies?" "Our marriage was built on your conditions," I corrected, my voice sharp. "I just found a way to live with them while still being true to myself." Principal Rothman cleared his throat again. "Mr. Kingsley, Dr. Hayes, while I appreciate that you have personal matters to resolve, I have a school to run. You're both valued additions to our staff, and I'd hate to lose either of you before the school year even begins." "You won't lose me," I assured him, straightening my shoulders. "I'm here to teach history, and that's exactly what I intend to do." Vince's silence was more concerning than any argument. When he finally spoke, his voice was unnervingly calm. "I need to think," he said, turning toward the door. "I'll be at my post." After he left, Principal Rothman sighed heavily. "Well, that was unexpected." I managed a weak smile. "Welcome to my marriage." "Are you going to be all right, Dr. Hayes?" The use of my professional title sent a thrill through me, even under these circumstances. For 14 years, I'd been Mrs. Kingsley to the world, Vince's wife, nothing more. Only in the academic circles I'd secretly cultivated had I been Dr. Hayes, scholar and author. "I'll be fine," I assured him. "Vince isn't, he won't make a scene. Not in public, anyway. At home would be a different story." Principal Rothman nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. "Your first class starts in 15 minutes. Perhaps you should head to your classroom." "Of course." As I gathered my belongings and headed toward my assigned room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd set something irreversible in motion. For 14 years, I'd maintained the precarious balance between being the wife Vince wanted and the scholar I needed to be. Now that balance was shattered, leaving me to wonder what would remain when the dust settled. My classroom was empty when I arrived, giving me a few precious minutes to collect myself. I arranged my books on the desk, wrote my name on the whiteboard, Dr. Abigail Hayes, and took a deep breath. Whatever happened with Vince, I wouldn't go back to hiding who I was. I'd spent too many years living a fractured existence, being one person at home and another in the academic world. It was exhausting, demeaning, and I was done. When the bell rang and students began filing in, I forced my personal turmoil aside and stepped into the role I'd worked so hard to earn. For the next 50 minutes, I wasn't Vince Kingsley's secretly educated wife, I was Dr. Hayes, history teacher, ready to illuminate the past for a new generation. But as I launched into my carefully prepared introduction, I couldn't help but wonder what history Vince and I would write together, or if our story had already reached its final chapter. The tension in our house that evening was thick enough to cut with a knife. Vince sat at the kitchen table, nursing a beer while I prepared dinner, an automatic routine I'd fallen into years ago, one of many compromises I'd made to keep the peace. "Why didn't you tell me?" he finally asked, breaking the silence that had stretched between us since we'd arrived home. "All these years, was any of it real?" I placed the knife I'd been using to chop vegetables carefully on the cutting board, wiped my hands on a towel, and turned to face him. "Of course it was real," I said. "I love you, Vince. That hasn't changed. But you lied to me. For our entire marriage." "I didn't lie. I just didn't tell you everything." Vince laughed bitterly. "That's a distinction without a difference, Abby." I leaned against the counter, suddenly exhausted. "What would you have done if I'd told you? If, 14 years ago, I'd said I wanted to pursue my education instead of being a full-time housewife?" He didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. "You would have said no," I continued. "You would have given me all the same reasons you gave when we first got married, that we couldn't afford it, that it was impractical, that your career needed to come first." "That was different," Vince protested. "I was a rookie cop with a mountain of debt. We were barely making ends meet. And 2 years later, when you got promoted. 5 years later, when you made detective. 10 years later, when you decided to retire from the force and take this security job." I shook my head. The timing was never right for me to pursue my dreams, but somehow it was always right for yours. Vince stood up, pushing his chair back with enough force that it scraped loudly against the tile floor. "That's not fair. I was building a career that would support us. That would give us security. And what about my career?" I shot back. "What about my security? What about my identity beyond being Mrs. Vincent Kingsley? Is that what this is about? Your identity?" His face flushed with anger. "You could have been anything you wanted, Abby. You could have opened that bakery you used to talk about. You could have written those novels you were always scribbling in your journals. But instead, you went behind my back to get some fancy degree that, what? Makes you feel superior?" I felt as if he'd slapped me. "Is that what you think of me? That I secretly pursued higher education just to one-up you?" "I don't know what to think anymore," Vince said, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I don't know who you are." "I'm the same person I've always been," I said quietly. "I just finally stopped hiding parts of myself to make you comfortable." Vince shook his head, his expression a mixture of hurt and bewilderment. 14 years, Abby. 14 years of lies. 14 years of compromise, I corrected. Of finding a way to be true to myself while still being the wife you wanted. And what kind of husband did you want? Vince demanded. Because clearly, I wasn't it. The question caught me off guard. What kind of husband had I wanted? One who supported my ambitions as much as I supported his. One who saw me as a partner, not a possession. One who celebrated my achievements instead of feeling threatened by them. I wanted a husband who would be proud of me, I said finally. Who would encourage me to grow, to learn, to become the best version of myself. And I wasn't that husband. It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. No. You weren't. The truth hung between us, raw and painful. Vince stared at me for a long moment, then grabbed his keys from the counter. I need some air, he muttered, heading for the door. Vince. But he was already gone, the door slamming behind him with a finality that made my heart ache. I stood in our kitchen, surrounded by the half-prepared meal, and felt the weight of 14 years of secrets pressing down on me. I had known this day would come eventually. Had known that I couldn't keep my two lives separate forever. But now that the moment had arrived, I was terrified of what it meant for our future. Because despite everything, despite the restrictions, the dismissal of my ambitions, the constant need to hide my true self, I still loved him. And I didn't know if that love could survive now that the truth was out. The next morning, I arrived at school early, hoping to avoid another confrontation with Vince. The school was quiet, most of the staff and students not due to arrive for another hour. I used the time to prep my classroom, organize my lecture notes, and brace myself for whatever the day might bring. A soft knock on my door interrupted my preparations. I looked up to find Diane standing in the doorway, a sympathetic expression on her face. Coffee, she offered, holding out a steaming cup. You look like you could use it. I accepted the cup gratefully. Thank you. Rough night, she asked, settling into one of the student desks. You could say that. Diane nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. I went through something similar when I first started teaching. My husband at the time couldn't handle having a wife with a career. He wanted me at home, taking care of him. What happened? I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. We divorced, she said matter-of-factly. Best decision I ever made. 30 years of teaching later, I've never regretted it. I sipped my coffee, letting her words sink in. Was that my future? Divorce, followed by a career I could finally pursue openly? Vince isn't a bad man, I said, feeling the need to defend him even now. He's just traditional. Traditional is fine if both parties agree, Diane replied. But when tradition becomes a cage that keeps one person from growing, it's no longer tradition, it's control. The word hit like a punch to the gut. Control. Had that been what our marriage was about all along? Had Vince's restrictions on my education been less about practicality and more about keeping me in a place where he felt comfortable? I don't know what to do, I admitted. I love him, but I can't go back to hiding who I am. Diane's expression softened. You shouldn't have to. The right partner celebrates your growth, not stifles it. Before I could respond, another knock sounded at the door. This time, it was Vince, still in yesterday's clothes, looking like he hadn't slept at all. Can we talk? He asked, his voice rough. Diane stood, giving my shoulder a supportive squeeze. Think about what I said, she murmured before leaving us alone. Vince took the desk she'd vacated, looking out of place in the small student seat. In his security uniform, with his broad shoulders and stern expression, he seemed to take up more space than the room allowed. "You didn't come home last night," I said, when it became clear he wasn't going to speak first. "I stayed at Mike's place. Needed time to think." He ran a hand over his face, the stubble on his jaw rasping against his palm. "Abby, I've been trying to understand why you'd go to such lengths to hide this from me." I sighed. "I told you." "I know what you told me," he interrupted. "That I wouldn't have supported your education. That I wanted a traditional wife. And maybe that was true when we first got married. But 14 years, Abby. You didn't trust me enough to even ask if I'd changed, if I could change." His words gave me pause. It was true, I'd made my decision based on who Vince had been at the beginning of our marriage. I'd never given him the chance to evolve alongside me. "You're right," I admitted. "I didn't. But can you honestly say that if, 5 years ago, I'd told you I wanted to pursue a doctorate, you would have supported me?" Vince hesitated, which was telling. "I don't know," he said finally. "But I should have had the chance to try." I felt a flicker of guilt, but it was quickly overshadowed by the memory of 100 small dismissals, the way he'd roll his eyes when I'd talk about a book I was reading, his patronizing tone when I'd share an interesting historical fact, his insistence that intellectual pursuits were a waste of time. "You showed me who you were," I said. "Every time you belittled my interests. Every time you made it clear that my intellectual curiosity was something to be tolerated, not celebrated." Vince winced. "Was I really that bad?" "Yes," I said simply. "You were." The bell rang, signaling the start of the school day. Soon, students would begin filing in, and this painful conversation would have to be put on hold. "We need to figure this out," Vince said, standing. "I can't work here, watching you live this other life that I knew nothing about." "And I can't quit," I replied. "This job is everything I've worked for." We stared at each other, at an impasse. The first students began trickling into the hallway outside, their voices echoing against the lockers. "I love you, Abby," Vince said, his voice softer than I'd expected. "But I don't know if that's enough anymore." As he walked out, I felt a sense of déjà vu, watching his back as he left me with more questions than answers. But this time, there was a crucial difference. This time, I wasn't the only one questioning the foundation of our marriage. This time, we were both forced to confront the truth about who we were, separately and together. And I wasn't sure either of us would like the answer. The next few days settled into an uneasy routine. Vince and I circled each other at school, maintaining a professional distance that fooled no one. At home, we slept in separate bedrooms and limited our conversations to the bare necessities of cohabitation: who would cook dinner, which bills needed to be paid, whose turn it was to take out the trash. It was a hollow imitation of our marriage, but I couldn't see a way forward that didn't involve one of us fundamentally changing who we were. And I'd spent enough years contorting myself to fit Vince's expectations. I wouldn't do it anymore. On Friday afternoon, I was gathering my things when a knock came at my classroom door. I looked up to find Principal Rothman standing there, his expression serious. "Dr. Hayes, do you have a moment?" "Of course," I said, gesturing for him to come in. "Is everything all right?" He closed the door behind him, which sent a jolt of anxiety through me. Closed-door conversations with principals were rarely good news. "I've received a request for transfer from your husband," Principal Rothman said, getting straight to the point. "He feels his continued presence here is complicating things." I felt a wave of relief, followed immediately by guilt. "I see. And you're granting his request?" "That's the thing," Principal Rothman sighed. I can't. Not right now. We've just begun the school year, and security positions at other schools in the district are filled. He'd have to wait until at least semester break for a transfer. I absorbed this information, unsure how to respond. On one hand, having Vince remain at the school would make our already strained situation even more difficult. On the other hand, I couldn't deny a small, petty part of me was pleased that he was the one who would have to compromise for once. I understand, I said finally. What do you need from me? Principal Rothman looked relieved. Just your assurance that you can continue to work together professionally, despite your personal differences. Of course, I said automatically. I'm a professional. My personal life won't affect my work. Excellent, he said, standing to leave. And Dr. Hayes? Your first week here has been impressive. The students are already talking about your classes. It's quite a change from Mr. Peterson's traditional approach to history. I smiled, genuinely pleased by the compliment. Thank you. That means a lot. After he left, I sat at my desk for a long time, thinking about Vince's request for transfer. It was the first concrete acknowledgement that our situation had changed irrevocably. He was planning for a future where we didn't work in the same building, perhaps a future where we didn't share the same life at all. The thought should have terrified me, but instead, I felt a strange sense of liberation. No more hiding. No more pretending to be less than I was. No more living two separate lives. Whatever happened between Vince and me, I would never go back to that fractured existence. When I arrived home that evening, I found Vince sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers. He looked up when I entered, his expression unreadable. Principal Rothman told me about your transfer request, I said, setting my briefcase on the counter. Vince nodded. And that it was denied, at least for now. Yes. I hesitated, then asked the question that had been nagging at me all afternoon. Is it really that unbearable? Working in the same building as me? It's not about being in the same building, Vince said, his voice tired. It's about watching you in your element, seeing how respected you are, how passionate about your work, and knowing that you felt you had to hide all of that from me. I sat down across from him, noticing for the first time what the papers on the table actually were. Printouts of my academic articles. A copy of my dissertation. Reviews of my published work. What's all this? Research, Vince said simply. I wanted to understand what I'd missed. Who you really are when you're not pretending to be the wife I thought I wanted. I picked up one of the papers, a review of my book on the civil rights movement that praised my incisive analysis and compassionate portrayal of complex historical figures. And? I asked, my heart pounding. What did you learn? Vince was quiet for a moment, organizing his thoughts. I learned that I've been an idiot, he said finally. An insecure, controlling idiot who was so afraid of being outshined that I tried to dim your light instead of basking in it. His words caught me completely off guard. In all our years together, I'd never heard Vince admit he was wrong about anything, let alone acknowledge a fundamental flaw in his character. Why were you afraid? I asked, genuinely curious. He shrugged, a gesture that seemed designed to minimize the vulnerability of his answer. I was a cop with a high school diploma. You were brilliant, even back then. I could see it in the way you devoured books, the way you'd engage strangers in deep philosophical discussions, the way your mind seemed to work at a different level than everyone else's. But you never said. I never said I was proud of you. Impressed by you? In awe of you? Vince shook his head ruefully. No, I didn't. Because admitting that would have meant admitting that you were exceptional and I was ordinary. I reached across the table and took his hand. You were never ordinary to me, Vince. You were brave and strong and dedicated to protecting others. That's extraordinary in its own way. He squeezed my hand, his eyes suspiciously bright. But it wasn't enough, was it? Not when I was also the man who made you hide your accomplishments. Who made you feel like your dreams were less important than mine. No, I admitted. It wasn't enough. We sat in silence for a moment, still holding hands across the table. It was the most physical contact we'd had in days, and I found myself craving more, a hug, a kiss, some tangible proof that we hadn't completely lost the connection that had once been the center of our lives. Where do we go from here? I asked, voicing the question that had been haunting me since that first confrontation in Principal Rothman's office. I don't know, Vince admitted. But I do know I don't want to lose you. Even if that means I have to become someone different. Someone better. The words were exactly what I'd longed to hear for 14 years. So why did they fill me with such trepidation? I don't want you to change for me, I said slowly. I want you to change for yourself. Because you genuinely believe I deserve to be celebrated for my achievements. Because you understand that my education doesn't diminish your worth. Vince nodded, his expression solemn. I want to try. Will you help me? It was a vulnerable request, one that acknowledged he couldn't transform overnight. That this would be a process of growth, of conscious effort to overcome years of ingrained beliefs about gender roles and intellectual pursuits. Yes, I said. I'll help you. But only if you promise to really listen. To challenge your own assumptions. To be willing to feel uncomfortable as you grow. I promise, Vince said, his voice thick with emotion. I can't lose you, Abby. These past few days have been hell, and not just because of the shock of discovering your secret life. It's been hell because I've had to face who I really am, and I don't like that person very much. I got up and moved around the table, perching on his lap the way I used to in the early days of our marriage. He wrapped his arms around me, holding me close, his familiar scent enveloping me. The fact that you can see that, I said, resting my head on his shoulder, gives me hope. The old Vince would have never admitted he was wrong. The old Vince was a fool, he murmured into my hair. A fool who almost lost the best thing in his life because of his own insecurity. As we sat there, holding each other in our kitchen, the same kitchen where we'd had countless arguments, where I'd hidden my academic achievements, where we'd begun the painful process of truth-telling, I felt a tentative hope bloom in my chest. Our marriage would never be what it was before. That carefully constructed facade had crumbled beyond repair. But perhaps from the rubble, we could build something new. Something authentic. Something equal. It wouldn't be easy. 14 years of patterns wouldn't change overnight. But for the first time, I believed it might be possible. I love you, I whispered against his neck. The real you. Not the image you try to project to the world. And I love you, he replied, his voice rough with emotion. The brilliant, passionate, determined woman you are. The woman I should have been celebrating all along. It wasn't a declaration of immediate change. It wasn't a guarantee that he would never again feel threatened by my achievements or struggle with his own insecurities. But it was a start. A recognition of the problem. A commitment to growth. And for tonight, that was enough. The weeks that followed were a delicate dance of rediscovery. Vince and I were essentially strangers to each other, meeting for the first time without the masks we'd both worn for so long. His of unquestioned authority, mine of diminished ambition. At school, we maintained a careful professional distance. Vince patrolled the hallways with his usual stern presence, though I occasionally caught him lingering outside my classroom, listening to my lectures with newfound interest. At home, we talked. Really talked, often late into the night, about everything we'd never discussed before: my research on civil rights movements, his struggles with the traumatic cases he'd handled as a detective, my frustration at being silenced, his fear of intellectual inferiority. Some conversations were painfully honest. Others ended in tears or slammed doors. But each one peeled back another layer of the facades we'd built, revealing the raw, authentic people underneath. One evening, about a month after our confrontation, Vince arrived home with a bouquet of sunflowers, my favorite, and a small wrapped package. "What's the occasion?" I asked, taking the flowers with a bemused smile. "No occasion," he said, looking slightly embarrassed. "I just wanted to show you I'm trying." I unwrapped the package to find a leather-bound journal embossed with my initials, AH, not AK. It was a small distinction but a meaningful one. An acknowledgement of my identity separate from his. "Open it," he urged. Inside, on the first page, he'd written, "To Dr. Abigail Hayes. I'm sorry I made you hide your light. Shine as brightly as you were always meant to. With pride and love. Vince." I traced the words with my fingertip, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. "It's for your notes," Vince explained, misinterpreting my silence as confusion. "For your next book. I thought you might want to start researching." I silenced him with a kiss, pouring into it all the complicated emotions I couldn't articulate: gratitude, hope, cautious optimism. "Thank you," I whispered when we broke apart. "It's perfect." That night, we made love for the first time since my secret had been revealed. It was different than before, more equal, more honest. I didn't hold back my strength or my passion. He didn't try to dominate or control. Instead, we met each other as partners, giving and taking in equal measure. Afterwards, lying in the tangle of sheets, I traced lazy patterns on his chest and spoke the thought that had been haunting me. "Do you think we would have married if you'd known the real me from the beginning? If I'd insisted on my education, my career, right from the start?" Vince was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "No," he admitted finally. "The man I was then wouldn't have had the courage to love a woman like you. He would have been too intimidated, too insecure." The honesty stung, but I appreciated it. "And now?" He turned to face me, his expression earnest. "Now, I'm still intimidated. Still insecure sometimes. But I'm also incredibly proud to be married to someone so accomplished. And I'd marry you again in a heartbeat, knowing everything I know now." I believed him, or at least, I believed he believed himself. Whether he could maintain that pride when faced with the reality of my career, the late nights grading papers, the weekends at academic conferences, the constant intellectual stimulation I craved, remained to be seen. But I was willing to find out. The real test came a few weeks later, when I was invited to speak at a conference in Boston. It was a prestigious opportunity, one that could enhance my academic reputation and potentially lead to more publishing opportunities. I brought it up over dinner, watching Vince carefully for his reaction. "A conference?" he repeated, fork halfway to his mouth. "For how long?" 3 days, I said. "Friday through Sunday. The school has already approved the time off." Vince set his fork down, his expression unreadable. "And you want to go?" "Yes," I said firmly, refusing to downplay the importance of the opportunity. It's a significant honor to be invited as a speaker. He nodded slowly, processing. The old Vince would have immediately listed all the reasons I shouldn't go: the expense, the inconvenience, the time away from home. The new Vince was clearly struggling with those same objections, but fighting to overcome them. That's great, Abby," he said finally, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "When is it?" "Next month," I said, relief washing over me. "November 12th through 14th. "I'll request those days off," Vince said, surprising me. "If you want, I could come with you. Not to the conference itself, but to Boston. We could make a mini vacation out of it." The offer caught me off guard. In all our years together, Vince had never shown any interest in accompanying me anywhere that didn't directly interest him. "You'd do that?" I asked, unable to keep the surprise from my voice. "Of course," he said, looking slightly hurt that I would question it. Why wouldn't I want to support my wife at an important professional event? I didn't answer the obvious, because you never have before, but the unspoken words hung in the air between us. "I'd like that," I said instead. "Thank you." Vince reached across the table, taking my hand. "I meant what I said about changing, Abby. I'm not perfect, and I'll probably mess up again. But I'm trying to be the husband you deserve." I squeezed his hand, touched by the sincerity in his eyes. "I know you are. And I'm trying to be patient, to understand that this is a big adjustment for both of us." "It is," he agreed. "But it's worth it. You're worth it." The words warmed me, despite the lingering doubt in the back of my mind. I wanted to believe him, to believe that our marriage could evolve into something healthier, more balanced. But years of conditioning had taught me to be wary of Vince's promises, to look for the subtle signs of resistance that always followed his initial support. The tightness around his eyes, the slight tension in his shoulders, they were there now, barely perceptible beneath his encouraging words. As the weeks passed and the conference approached, I waited for the other shoe to drop. For Vince to find a reason why he couldn't accompany me after all. For the passive-aggressive comments about my priorities to begin. But they never came. Instead, he helped me prepare my presentation, sitting patiently as I practiced it multiple times. He bought me a new professional outfit for the occasion. He even researched Boston restaurants near our hotel, planning a celebration dinner for after my speech. The night before we were due to leave, I found him in our bedroom, carefully packing his suitcase with the same military precision he applied to every task. "Are you nervous?" he asked, noticing me watching from the doorway. "A little," I admitted, though my anxiety wasn't solely about the presentation. Vince crossed the room and took my hands in his expression earnest. "You're going to be amazing. I've heard your speech, it's brilliant. They're lucky to have you." I searched his face for any sign of insincerity, any hint of the resentment I'd grown so accustomed to detecting. There was none. "Thank you," I whispered, feeling a knot of tension I hadn't even realized I was carrying begin to unravel. "For everything." He pulled me into his arms, holding me close. "No, Abby. Thank you for giving me another chance. For believing I could be better." I rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. There was still so much uncertainty ahead of us, so many old patterns to break, so much trust to rebuild. But for the first time in 14 years, I felt like we were truly partners, walking the same path instead of pulling in opposite directions. And that was a beginning worth believing in.